Hello, and welcome to today's complimentary Control webinar, The Great Debate. Can M365 be your records repository? Thank you so much for joining us today for a lively discussion. Now for some housekeeping items. Note today's presentation will be recorded. This recording will be shared with you via email tomorrow. At the end of today's presentation, we will show a list of upcoming webinars. If you or any colleagues are interested in joining future sessions, please visit us at contourl.com and select the Events tab to register. We will also share white papers, blog posts, and articles we've recently posted. There will also be a post-event survey that we invite you to complete, as we truly do value and appreciate your feedback. If you have any follow-up questions or comments or would like access to our resources, please feel free to reach out to us at info@contourl.com. And I highly encourage you to ask questions today using the Q&A box, as the speakers welcome and appreciate your input. Thank you, and now I'll turn it over to Mark Diamond.
Thank you very much, Veronica. And, can Microsoft 365 really hold records? That's a question a lot of organizations are asking themselves. And what can they hold? And is it for everything or not? And what version do we need to use? And how, a lot of, when we think of Microsoft 365, we think of SharePoint, and that brings back a lot of people to thinking how SharePoint was when it was on-prem, which was sort of all over the place. And there's some real doubts. I mean, it doesn't always feel like it's a real repository. So I'm Mark Diamond. I'm going to be your moderator today, and we're very fortunate to have Greg Forrest. Greg, welcome.
Thank you.
Greg is CTO
Well,
of
see me
Control.
25 years ago every now and then.
Yes, I think we all do that to some extent. And Nandeep, you're a little more current. Nandeep, welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
And I think this is a very important point to point out. We are going to discuss Microsoft 365. As many of you know, Control does not sell any products, nor do we take any referral fees, nor do we store any documents or do any reactive e-discovery. So we are not being paid to say good things or bad things about M365. This is purely based on our experience, having helped dozens, hundreds of companies implement information governance with a variety of products. And so it's just you do it enough and you get some opinions, not because we're paid for it. So I've got the easy part today. I'm going to ask a bunch of questions. And the first one I'm going to ask is, okay, is M365, let's hit it up front, is it really a records repository?
Certainly has the capability if it's configured properly. I think is the right question. All the components are there, from the individual storage areas where you might put records for group use, records for department use, records for collaboration, even records as they come through email. They definitely have places to store information, but you need to configure it properly in order for it to become a records repository. It doesn't come that way out of the box necessarily.
The way that most people have it set up today, is it a real records repository or not?
Well, it depends on whether they've been through a process to apply appropriate retention policies on some things and retention labels on files. So that's a good question. I think it really depends on where you are in your journey with Microsoft 365. If you just turned it on in COVID and just left it on, probably not. But if you've begun the process of actually using the capabilities, then yeah, you're probably getting there.
And I'm just asking, I'm sorry, go ahead, Andy.
It also is one of the good things within Microsoft 365 is that you can follow the life cycle of it from where you start to where you end. So again, it really depends on, whether you are starting with OneDrive as your individual workspace and drafts and moving into SharePoint as your final records repository. So as long as they have that thing figured out and, are being using for that right purpose and use case, you can end up making SharePoint as your final records repository as long as you have those design considerations in place.
And are there companies that have put records in Microsoft 365 and a regulator has come in or a court has come in and they said, hey, this is okay? I mean, is that compliant and defensible, I guess?
Absolutely. Now, again, we're going to talk about a couple of different types of records and regulations around records. that may change that answer a little bit, but yes, absolutely, it is considered a standard record repository. And in fact, some very stringent regulations have used SharePoint as their back end. So absolutely.
And I would want to invite the audience. We're keeping an eye on all the questions here. And so we have obviously have our own questions we're going to ask, but if you have other questions you want to post, we're going to do our best to get through everything. So we want to make this as interactive as possible. You know, and I'll go to Greg or Nandit. You know, M365, does it coexist with other repositories? Does it replace them? What are you seeing out there?
Well, I mean, a lot of companies have over time bought individual solutions for certain parts of what Microsoft has bundled together as a suite. It's certainly complementary. It's some of the items over on the right side of one-off solutions, document repositories, video chat repositories, repositories for peer-to-peer sharing, actually have integrations with Microsoft, some of them stronger than others. OnBase, for instance, does. Box, of course, does. So there's a lot of different ways that people use systems. That said, Microsoft offers a complete ecosystem, so it's more of a suite than a solution that just does one thing. I would also consider Google Workspace a suite, although probably not with the level of governance controls that Microsoft has.
And I don't have the statistics available, but do you see Microsoft 365 in a lot of places?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, I think a lot of people use it for email. It's probably the 90% most used email system in enterprises. Other areas may not have quite the same level of upkeep or uptake in certain enterprises, and it really just depends on how they began and how they started. A lot of startups tend to go with the Googles and the Boxes of the world, and then potentially as they get larger and larger, move into something more comprehensive like a suite like Microsoft, although we have very large clients that are also on Google Drive. So
Yeah, but what Greg said, it's pretty much, I would say most of the clienteles do have the Outlook for managing their email. So in one way or the other, they do have the licenses for it. Now they might not be using the other components of Microsoft 365 necessarily, but at least they do have one of the component, which is, what we look at, that if you do have things in place, then might as well use it as like one-stop shop.
Okay. Well, I guess moving along and okay, so M365 can be a repository, but what's the difference between just using M365 and actually governing your data with Microsoft 365?
So when you talk about governance, I mean, I think we're talking about records repositories mostly here in this webinar, but governance is a lot more than that. There's a lot of different parts of governance. There's your retention, there's sensitivity for privacy, intellectual property, there's who can share what with who, there's of course data loss prevention to keep information from going outside your firewall, there's security issues with websites, cyber type of stuff, there's what do we do about phones, what do we do about iPads, there's how do we put all this stuff together. That becomes governance. And what is fairly unique about Microsoft is they have solutions built into your license for all of these things. Now, you may not get every single feature with a normal license. We'll talk about licenses in a little bit, but they're available and they're integrated in all four components that we talked about where you might be keeping things. Certainly all can be using the same functionality to do governance. And I think that's one of the places where they stand out, is that they've bought companies or invested in R&D to be able to cover all the bases across the board for protecting your files and your emails.
We have a question here. If we use Microsoft as our full suite and our cloud-based repository, do you recommend we back it up with a third party? With the recent Microsoft issues, it's a bit unsettling to put all of our eggs in a single basket.
That's a really good question. It really just depends on your high availability or your disaster recovery stance. Microsoft certainly takes your information and breaks it into multiple pieces and stores it all over the place. If one of the servers that the primary server you're on goes down, There's blobs stored in other geographies that can instantly come up and take over. So from that perspective, they have that capability. The reason that some of our clients do backups in addition to what Microsoft does for high availability is for people deleting things months ago. Microsoft typically has a 90-day recovery time. If IT really wants to be able to recover a file that's 6 months or a year old, those backups become relevant for that purpose. But in general, most of the breaches and other issues that you see with Microsoft are mostly for on-premises systems, not for those in the cloud. It's hard to create the same infrastructure for high availability as Microsoft does in their own environment, in their cloud environment.
And I'll ask the question. I think that this is much less of an issue. But can we trust putting stuff in the cloud? And there are a few companies that still ask that question.
I knew you'd ask that question. So if you'd asked that question 5 or 10 years ago, it would have been a reasonably valid question, I believe. In today's environment, I think almost every client that we have has multiple software as a solution applications that live in the cloud, and it's been proven that the ability of a large company like Microsoft to create data centers and spend the money to make them secure is a lot more than you can do yourself on premises with today's shrinking IT budgets. So I would say yes, in some ways the cloud is more secure.
Well, and I guess the argument is if you with Microsoft you have 400 or 500 people managing your security versus if you're doing it yourself, you obviously
a few more than that, but yes.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep the questions going, and thank you for being able to do that. One question gets up a lot. Okay, so I want to use M365 for information governance. And a lot of people here, matter of fact, from Microsoft, oh boy, you need to buy the E5 license to be able to do that. Do you need to buy the E5 license if you really want to use Microsoft to manage records?
So the answer is you can manage records easily with an E3 license, but there are functionalities that are available in an E5 that may make it more automated. Things like automated data classification, things like being able to review items before they're disposed at the end of their retention period, certain types of e-discovery capability that are not available in the standard license. But in general, the ability to place retention labels on folders, on libraries, on sites, and default the automated retention of information is available with an E3 license. You do not need an E5. So it's more of a setup, configure, and then a manual effort than necessarily trying to auto-classify everything. But we'll get into that subject a little later. But in general, an E3 license can certainly handle allowing you to be compliant with your record retention schedule and SharePoint, Teams, email, and OneDrive.
Do you find that everybody's an E3, everybody's an E5, or is it hybrid where some of the people on E5 and the rest on E3? What do you think works?
A lot of our clients are E3 for their standard licenses, and then they do get a security and compliance add-on that gives them E5 capabilities for the security side of the house. That is fairly common, as that's probably the most common combination. I'd say that most companies start with an E3 and then graduate to an E5, but not necessarily for record retention. That's usually not one of the most common reasons for people to go to an E5 license. There's a lot of functionality that comes with doubling the cost per employee, and usually it's other sets of functionality that push a company to go to an E5 license.
And sometimes I'm sorry, Nandy, go on.
No, Mark. So it just again comes down to, like Greg said, if it's retention is you specifically care about, yes, E3 is good enough. There are clients who are looking for a lot of other things that E5 comes with, in terms of baggage from the security side as well, from endpoint DLP and from mobile capability. So yeah, if you do not have those things to start with, then it comes down to in the cost benefit analysis in terms of, should I just go with E5 for all customers since I do not have all those things that I need from the security side and from retention and from e-discovery, or if it's just the retention that I care about, then in that case, like you say, you start with E3. There are a few IT administrators that might have E5 just to see, the capabilities, and then as they mature and as they want to go into automation, that's when they might eventually move into E5 if required.
All right, so one more question on this topic, which is Microsoft itself sometimes tells companies that, oh, you have to have an E5 license. Why is that? Or I should say, they say everybody needs an E5 license.
So again, with an E5 license, you get additional functionality for records management. And so Microsoft would prefer that you be in an environment that has all the whistles and bells. But it's not absolutely necessary. And Mandeep, if you want to answer Ralph's question?
Sorry, what was that?
Can it be done with Microsoft 365 Business Premium? He's asking.
Yeah, so Business Premium is for smaller organizations.
Business Premium is just like, yeah, you're right. It's kind of what the E5 is, but it's for limited users, right? If you have 300 users or less is when you use the Business Premium capabilities. Now, there are a few things that you cannot do with Business Premium, but most of it is at par with what the E5 can do with a limited set of users, like 300 and less.
And for government versions, is E3 equivalent to G3 and E5 equivalent to G5, or is those different products, or they're synonymous, just different names for the same thing?
Yeah, those are government clouds that you have with synonymous. Again, E5 are commercial licenses, they are top of the line. Few features here or there you might not see, but most of it, when you say E5 or G5 and premiums, they are pretty much at the par.
Okay, keep those questions coming. Okay, how about large files? Can you or should you store large files in Microsoft 365, SharePoint, or Teams?
I would say yes. Short answer is yes. You can use Microsoft 365 to store large files. Again, there are some limits and design consideration depending on what your use case is and where you want to store them within Microsoft 365. I would say that by default, you can store a file as large as 250 gigabytes per file on SharePoint, on Teams, and OneDrive. And with email, I believe there is a limit of 150 MB, but again, you're not using Gmail to store your records, so that's out of the equation. But again, there are few constraints within Microsoft 365 you need to keep in mind. As you can see here, it's one of the things is that the default storage limit that is available in SharePoint is limited per tenant, and so it's 1 terabytes plus 10 GB per user. So what it comes down to that everything you're storing additional over that, you are actually paying additional to keep things, and then that might not be what you need because most of your files are large CAD files or design files, and they are pretty much going to be an archive. So which I'll talk about that in a minute, is there are alternate options, but that is one of the consideration that when you go over the limit, you start paying by GB on that. Another thing is also what we see is that the performance consideration. So, when you store large files, especially when you are syncing those files from your SharePoint to your local OneDrive client, you start seeing performance issues every time you're uploading or downloading, as well as timeout, like sync timeout issues. And that's one of the factors that we do see when you start storing large files in Microsoft 365. And another thing is also versioning. So when you start versioning the files, each version is a separate file. So which means, let's say there's a 500 gig file, you create 10 versions. There are 10 100 gig files that you're storing. Comes back to the same question of it starts adding to your overall storage. And then finally, there is an indexing issue. So some files that are quite large files, you start seeing issues in terms of indexing those files, and you cannot preview those files, so they might not come up in your search results. That also impacts your collaboration, overall at the end of the day, because they are not easily viewable, they cannot be co-authored, so that impacts the productivity as well. So those are some of the constraints, and again, as long as you're keeping those in mind, yes. But then we have a couple of clients that typically have that specific needs that that goes beyond Microsoft 365's capability, and so you can still be in that Microsoft world, but then what you can use is called Azure blob storage, which is an alternate solution. And these are again for your massive files, right? So files that are huge, that are either application generated huge files, that are design files, that are drawing files. And so for those specific use cases, you can use Azure Blob Storage. And at the same time, it allows you to then integrate with Microsoft Purview, which is the backend, to take the benefits of retention and sensitivity and all other compliance things you can do. I mean, the scalability, it's like virtually you can store unlimited things in the object storage up to petabytes. And that's what people typically in those use cases go into that scenario. Also, in terms of cost, again, if these are not your active files, then it definitely makes sense to move to Azure, because it's much more cost efficient in terms of how much you are paying. And if they are going to be archived, it might be sitting over there, then it's better to go over there. Also, the lifecycle optimization is great over there, because you can now put things into hot tier to cool tier, and then also you can have archives that does the whole lifecycle piece. So you can start active over there, but then it can go into the cold storage, and it can stay there as an archive, and also you can apply the immutability as well on top of it. So basically, it's just like BOM, like write once, read many, and then that's another thing that you can do with Azure Blob Storage. So these are some of the alternate options and capabilities you can do with Azure Blob Storage, but it really comes down to what your use case is. In terms of key takes away, Microsoft 365 can certainly store large files, but again, it's designed more for collaboration, for your active content. It's not for your massive files and archival system. On the other hand, Azure Blob is primarily for your archives, for your scalability, for immutability, and also for the cost efficiency for those large files.
Okay, so there are some cases where for large files, the best practice may not be storing at M365, just to be clear, is what you're saying, and looking at something like Azure. Yeah, Greg?
So Aaron asks, doesn't Azure Blob add a lot of complexity for users if using it for infrequent files? What about SharePoint archive storage options? Yes, that will reduce your cost, absolutely. But again, the people that are using Azure Blob are basically people that have extremely large files. I mean, we're talking hundreds of gigabytes, even terabyte sized files for simulations, construction projects, things like that. In which case it makes a lot more sense for them to go ahead and put it in a file share type environment and then use third-party tools or hardware solutions that actually cache that information locally to wherever people are. So understand that even though you're doing archiving in SharePoint, and yes, that's a lower price point, you still have all the issues with SharePoint in terms of speed of retrieval and some of those types of things. It's much easier to use Azure Blob for that type of storage. And as Nandip said, the good news is you're still using exactly the same Purview tools to do retention controls, to apply retention labels, to put particular retention at a blob level or a container level. Really great if you've got a construction project that's finished, but you're required by law to keep all the files for 30 years, move it out into Azure, put that 30-year retention against it, and now you've got it safe. You can always retrieve it for regulatory purposes, but it's not taking up precious collaborative space in SharePoint. And I think that's probably the way to think about the two solutions combined together.
Yeah, also with SharePoint Archive, one thing I'll mention is, yes, definitely that's an option, but it is also the model that they're design is very much like how Iron Mountain used to be. Like anytime you retrieve a box, you have to pay for it as well. So let's say if you need to get things primarily for business users to view something, then you have to unarchive it, and then there is a cost on top of that to unarchive things. So that's a consideration.
I think Iron Mountain still charges that way. Moving on. Our users don't take time to label files and using drop-down menus. And so thinking, hey, this great as SharePoint, but they're having a devil of a time getting users to classify files. And does that make it less desirable to use M365?
So that is one of the nice things about Microsoft. It does not use a lot of metadata fields or you don't have to use custom metadata fields in order to enforce retention. You can apply retention at the site level or the library level or a folder level or even a subfolder level. And then anything that's automatically put in those areas, whether it's created, dragged and dropped, save as from a Microsoft application like Word, into those areas automatically picks up the retention controls. So from an end user perspective, they're not managing retention. Your records manager, your IT folks are applying those labels on the back end, and once they're set in the filing structure, there really isn't any maintenance, and there's no end user impact by the fact that retention is occurring. So I think the answer is absolutely. You can set up a system by which employees just put the files in the right place. They don't need to worry about tagging every file or adding additional metadata in order to get appropriate retention.
Moving along, can we use Microsoft 365 to store GXP records? And Greg, what's a GXP record?
GXP record is a record that typically in healthcare or pharma that needs to be kept in what is known as a validated system. Now, Microsoft 365, i.e. SharePoint, could be a validated system, but every time there's a major change, you have to go ahead and validate again. So it is not an ideal solution. Now, that said, there are many vendors that sell validated solutions for keeping that type of information who actually use SharePoint as their back end. But there it is the vendor that does the validation so that you don't have to do it over and over again every time SharePoint changes or every time you're sharing or saving different types of GXP information. So from that perspective, as a general purpose system, we don't necessarily recommend that you try to do that on your own. Instead, buy a validated system from a GXP vendor that actually does that work for you.
Do you ever see any of the life sciences clients use native Microsoft 365 for GXP? I mean, do you have anybody?
Yeah,
that's been through that?
at the beginning, frankly, a lot of startups will do this, and they get to the point where they are ready for trials or ready for release, and then they have to put that information in a validated system, and they'll typically move out of Microsoft 365 at that point.
Okay. Next question is, likewise, can M365 meet 17A4 requirements? And this is for the financial service dealers, it's broker-dealer requirements. And so can we use it for 17A4 and the WORM requirements?
So again, this will take an E5 license. And because you basically need to make sure that the record becomes read-only and cannot be modified even by an administrator. So you need to use the regulated record functionality that only comes with an E5 license. So that would be one way to do that. The other way to do that would be to go ahead and put it into Azure Blob Storage, where it can still be retrieved by the third party. But again, it is read-only and cannot be modified. So, it's just, those are the two real options. We absolutely have clients that are using Microsoft to keep 17A4 data. But again, you have to use the appropriate functionality that's only available in records management with an E5 license.
Right. When we had SharePoint on premise, there were hundreds of sites where there's a lot of frustration. You mentioned SharePoint, and for a number of information governance professionals, this brings up bad memories of when when SharePoint was on-prem and there was like hundreds of SharePoint sites and it was just a mess. And the question is, are we making the same mistakes? Are we doing the same sins now that we're going for M365 in the cloud?
You can take this one.
So basically, when you say sprawl, I mean, it really, one of the things as a part of the process would be just to see what needs to be moved into Microsoft 365, right? And it again comes back to the life cycle on what should be going in Teams, and it's really a record that is for collaboration and cross collaboration, what is for SharePoint. But if that planning is taken into place, then a lot of that can be done upfront in terms of, what are the things that needs to be moved, what can be left behind, what are truly records, and what can be let gone. But a lot of times we do see that people just move things as is, like lift and shift, and then you just end up being another dumping ground. Now again, having those retention controls and classifying things will eventually things will start following up. But we always like the way to, an approach where before you move into from on-prem to online is to review what you have and see what needs to be moved and what needs to be kept behind, instead of just moving everything as is. But it comes down to, like I said, process, the design and planning, rather than just moving everything as is.
Well, what about companies? A lot of companies moved to Microsoft
I think
365 in a rush during the pandemic, right? And so, in a perfect world, they would have done that. But are we just have the potential of recreating the problem now?
Well, I think the issue here is that go ahead. By default, end users can create new team sites with SharePoint sites underneath, and that can become an issue. So it really depends on your provisioning posture. Do you require people to get approval and have IT create sites, or are you letting users self-service create the sites themselves? Now, if they're doing self-service, then sprawl is quite easy to occur because people will do test sites. They'll create a site thinking it's a good idea, and then no one will ever use it, so it just sits there forever. You really do need to have some type of monitoring and management and provisioning strategy in order to make sure that sites are set up properly. And a lot of clients, like you said, Mark, during COVID, allowed that free form, everybody creates a site type of thing. You do need to do a one-time cleanup to figure out which ones are being used, and there are lots of tools to do that within Purview. And then after that is done, then put on some restrictions on who can create a site and for what purpose.
Right, and I guess this goes hand in hand. How do we move from network shares to Microsoft 365, and can it be done? And I'm going to make the argument too, add to this question, can we move from unmanaged Microsoft 365 content all over the place, where people just sort of threw stuff off lift and shift, to managed environments? I mean, what's the process for that?
You've been involved in this many times.
Okay, yeah. I mean, so this is typically what you're looking at is a typical process that we do in terms of moving things. Now, again, whether it's, like you said, lift and shift, you move to Microsoft 365 to get off the file shares or on-prem, and just you moved everything as the way it was, or you are still on file shares. But overall, in terms of process, what we typically like to do is what we call as review, analyze, clean up, and then migrate. That's one. I mean, that is one of the approaches, but that's the one that we typically recommend, because doing that allows you to look at what you currently have and only move things that you need to, and keeping the rest behind. Maybe because that's a rot, or these are things that your department doesn't necessarily own. And doing this process where we collect what you have, work with the business to classify that information and to make a decision on what needs to go forward through different sessions with those business by business, and then moving them, basically preparing their go forward file plan with the nice right classification codes that we already captured from those sessions, and then creating that go forward structure and making sure that go forward structure is compliant and has the necessary codes pre-built for sensitivity, for retention, and for overall productivity. That allows them to build that new compliant house, and then that way they can go forward and start managing their information in that new compliant house, instead of having to take all the clutter with them. And that's the typical process that we like to do, is, like I said, just review, analyze.
A couple of things with that. First, you want the business to define the file structure. So you want to use their names, the ones that they're comfortable with. And I think the second side of that is you want to make sure that you are creating a structure that can be easily classified, that it's easy for an end user to know, hey, this type of document needs to go in this folder, and put the right controls underneath it so that the structure actually becomes the way by which you're managing things. I think the other primary piece here is that if you're talking about existing SharePoint or existing team sites, you can go ahead and retrofit those sites with the labels in the existing structure. So this isn't always a migration activity. It doesn't mean you have to start fresh with a brand new green field. In some cases, you can take your existing sites, classify them in the same way with that mapping session of a show and tell with a work group, and then establish the appropriate labels. So it's not always about migration. It's not always about moving from old to new. In some cases, it's about retrofitting the existing.
We have a question
Yeah,
here. This slide implies that everything goes to Microsoft 365. Is that what you're saying here, that everything should go in Microsoft? No, okay. Just want a clarification. Sorry, Nandi, if I cut you off.
I was just, no, this is a process, right, that has been developed. It's the example here you are showing, yes, it's Microsoft 365, but this process is technology agnostic. So the idea is to work with that business to understand what information they have. And like Greg said, we are not trying to force them to create their folder structure according to the schedule, but just understand what they have so that we can classify and put the code underneath. But then from there, it's really up to them in terms of what solution they have in terms of where they want to migrate. We just help them create that structure. Certainly, if it is Microsoft 365, there are those capabilities that you can pre-code and make it ready for that compliance system. But it could be any system. The process is not specific to a technology.
I've heard this complaint. Some users out there had problems with Microsoft 365 supporting long file names. And specifically, it's, hey, it seems like when you're using Microsoft 365, and if you have nested files and long file names, that pretty soon M365 says, nope, that doesn't work. I mean, is this a huge limitation of Microsoft 365?
Wouldn't say it's a limitation. Well, I mean, let me start with that Microsoft does support long file names, like file folders. And as you can see over here, you can have a file name as long as 400 characters. But what it comes down to, and there are limitations around that. So what it comes down to is this, it's the overall path, right? So it used to be 260 characters. They extended to 400 characters in the SharePoint Online and OneDrive Online. So as long as your entire path is not more than that, you are fine, right? So it could be a file in the root file, which is long enough, that is, less than 400 characters, or it could be folders and subfolders and nested folders, and the URL, the entire URL that comes down to, the length of 400 characters. So you can basically create long files, but again, there are some things, that you need to be aware of. And one of the things is also that when you do sync your SharePoint libraries or folders into OneDrive, and at that point of time, if there are files or the path is longer than 260 characters, then you start getting errors, because then it's not the SharePoint or Microsoft, it hits the Windows or the NTFS limit, right? So again, to subvert that issue, you can open those files from SharePoint, open those files from OneDrive Online. But if you do have files synced on your local OneDrive and you try to open that file, then it will hit the limit, the 260 character limit, and it will start throwing errors. So basically what I'm saying is that in terms of the best practices, it's always good to make sure that, whenever you create your file names or you design your file names, you have proper naming convention. You shouldn't be having file names that, have like, for example, if it's a financial document, you do not want the whole year and month and the quarter and also the timestamp. That's basically, basically means that you're creating a long file name, and actually you don't really need to create that file name. You can use the search to get information they're looking for. It doesn't have to be in a part of the file name. So that's one of the best practices, to always make sure that whenever you're creating folders or even file names, they are simplified, they are following basic naming convention, and also avoid deep nesting of folder structure. This is something we always see when we are actually doing mapping sessions with the business, is they have like 20 level deep folder structure, when some of these could basically split up and could be a top level folder on itself instead of going that down the lane. So it's better to also simplify the folder structure and avoiding that deep nesting of folder structure. Another thing we always like to do is that before migration, you can run scripts. Even with Microsoft migration tool, you can run reports and scripts that shows that the overall URL path is more than 400 characters or not, and those prescripts will alert you so that you know, and you can let the business know that these files won't go, or they will go but they won't open when you try to open it because it is hitting the character limit. And then finally, it's always training education is always one of the important things that we do, is to tell people that yes, we have made your house ready, but now as you start maintaining yourself, keep things in mind that, things like when you create a file, what are the things, you need to keep in mind in naming that file, or even if when you're renaming a file or renaming a folder, do not keep it too long, do not have too many folders and subfolders. So that definitely goes into the overall chain management training.
So just so I understand, you can run into issues with long file names, but if you do, maybe you need to look at your design, and maybe it's more of a design issue than be at a limitation, but maybe the problem isn't Microsoft, maybe it's your taxonomy and design.
It is a design for
Carolyn
sure.
asks, go ahead, sorry, Nadia.
I'm saying it is definitely a design. It's a design, but again, you typically wouldn't see a file or that is 400 characters long, or a folder structure that is going that deep. We hardly see that, but yes, if you do hit that, it is definitely a thing to reconsider about the overall design that you have.
So I have a question from Carolyn asking, please elaborate what SharePoint Sync with OneDrive is. Really quickly, there are two ways by which you can access files from within OneDrive on SharePoint. One is a shortcut that allows you to see SharePoint as a set of folders, just like you would a network drive or a file share, and therefore interact with SharePoint without actually opening SharePoint. But there's another functionality, which is to sync that library with your OneDrive, in which case the files are actually downloaded to your OneDrive so that if you go offline and have no network, you can still access them. That sync obviously creates a lot of traffic on the network and also takes a lot of space up on your hard drive. So if you've got that sync on, and we're talking about very large files, that can absolutely be an issue. And in this particular case, Windows has a 256 character limitation, so that, or 259, sorry, so that if you have a 400 character file name in SharePoint and you sync that file into OneDrive, you won't be able to access it because OneDrive won't be able to get to all 400 characters. So Windows Explorer actually, so that's a Windows issue as opposed to a Microsoft 365 issue. I'm sure at some point Microsoft will sync the two together, and there are ways even to increase that limit on Windows with some back-end work by your IT folks.
Okay. Moving along, can we use Purview trainable classifiers to classify all records? And I'm going to wrap another question in there. Angelique asked, do you recommend using Microsoft Purview's records management full capabilities E5 to manage the full life cycle of records in a large government organization? So let's talk about the trainable classifiers with Purview. It should, you're talking about this, you got to put stuff, employees do a data placement strategy. It's simple, they put it in a folder, but can we skip all that and just teach Purview to find all of our records via trainable classifiers?
Yeah, so let me first talk about the trainable classifier, just a quick intro on that. I mean, it is a Microsoft Purview machine-based learning model that automatically identifies and categorizes all your information within Microsoft 365, whether they are emails, documents, team messages, all of that, based on the examples of real data, right? So just relying on keywords and pattern matching and search terms, it's just relying on the actual files. Unlike the traditional rule-based detection, you train these classifiers. That's the idea, to train these classifiers and providing a set of examples and documents, both positive and negative. And so basically the model is trained and it learns what is the right record type. And you can do this both for your retention and also for your sensitivity. So you can train them so it knows that, what type of retention code should be applied from your schedule by training that. And you can do the same thing for your sensitivity labels, that it says if it's a PII or if it's a IP content, or if it is, something that is like a PC or PHI, all of that can be trained. And the question is that if you should be using Purview trainable classifiers, and it really depends on what stage you are in your compliance maturity. like you said, first of all, trainable classifier is an E5 capability. So only if you have E5 licenses, you can do that. And if you don't, you cannot use it, that one feature. But I would also say that from at least from the experiences and the clients that we work with, some of the pre-built pre-trainable classifiers that Microsoft has, like for HR data and for contracts and agreements for your source code, it works pretty well. They are reasonably mature. I would say they're production ready. But there are these custom classifiers that you have created that are specifically to the business that your organization does, and kind of operational records. They, to me, are at very early stage in building the AI models, and it definitely requires continuous training, continuous fine-tuning. So for those, I would suggest that it is still in very early stage, and the idea is to keep testing that out, seeing at a smaller stage if how good they are, how accurate they are, check the accuracy, and then if you do feel that it's basically capturing your records the way they are and automatically applying the code, then you then release it to the enterprise, right? So basically, it's the predefined and the custom ones. The custom ones require more work and are in very early stage according.
Okay, and so just again, so I understand, trainable classifiers can find some of the data, but I'm assuming we cannot depend on trainable classifier to find all the records accurately. Is that, am I summarizing what you said correctly?
That too, and also the bigger question is if these are records or not. That is something the trainable classifier doesn't know, right? So let's say I trained a model by saying these are all my HR, job applications. But you might be having a record repository, and you might also be having copies and places that are drafts. And what trainable classifier does, if you open it, it will just go and it will just apply that code on everything when some of them these are not your truly records. And then now you're keeping everything, just even the drafts and your copies for that long as your record. So that's another thing that you need to be also aware of.
Yeah, I think a good example is, say that you had a financial statement that you created that was the record, and then you sent it to all the employees in the company so they could see the state of the company. Each one of them saves that to their OneDrive. Now you have thousands of copies of that financial statement, all of which would be classified as records, and all the places that they live. And so that may not be what you want. A lot of groups are going to take convenience copies from one department and save it locally so that they have ease of access and go faster. Those will also be classified as records. And so now you've got a much larger body of information being classified in that way. It's really difficult for an engine to say this is the real copy and this is the number one copy and these are all the others. Now there are ways around this by using links and all kinds of other things, but at any rate, this is an area that's getting more and more precise. AI is certainly going to add some capability here. I think at some point in the future, you might be able to get to a fairly high level of classification with these automated tools. But at this point, most companies are finding that it's harder to fine tune these machines and teach them what is and isn't a record than to rely on it. So for now, most people are doing a combination of automated classification, as Mandeep has put on this slide, mostly for personal information and other information they want to be very much protect on an automated basis, but most of their records, again, are having default retention placed on them based on where they're stored inside particular repositories.
Okay, we have a question from Aaron. People don't like switching from using a network drive structure to the SharePoint web interface. Are there any tools that could make SharePoint look more like a folder structure? And Aaron, I agree with you 100%. I don't like the web version, as Greg did.
So again, that's what we were talking about in terms of creating shortcuts to the libraries that are in SharePoint where the documents are stored to your OneDrive, because then it looks to you just like another folder like it used to on the network drive. So if I had a library where I did my accounts receivable work that used to be on the shared drive, and now it's on SharePoint, one time I have to go say, now make this library on my OneDrive. It will appear as a folder, and if I open it, I can see all the subfolders and the subfolders. I can do save as, I can do creates, I can do everything through my OneDrive interface without ever having to see the web interface of SharePoint. So yes, that is the major way that we train users that do not want to make that switch to use it that way. Aaron, I'm not talking about sync. I'm talking about shortcut. I do not think sync is a good idea. Microsoft should have never turned that on. It is designed for salespeople that need to have files on their laptop when they're on a plane and can't get good network connectivity. Shortcuts are very different than syncs. Shortcuts only are going to show you the structure, and then when you click on it, it basically opens the file. So it's a very different type of thing, and there aren't the same limitations on shortcuts as there are on full sync. So.
Yeah, and I've got just add a couple of things on that. With shortcuts, the option that we are recommending, you do not have to shortcut the entire library. If it's only 1 or 2 folders that you're working, it allows you to shortcut folders as well. With sync, you have to sync the entire library. And then another thing is that even with shortcuts, if you do have to go off network, you can always do a right click and make it offline, make changes to it. And then when you get back into the network, it automatically, synchronizes in the SharePoint. So even shortcut does have those capabilities, but again, the use cases are different. But this is the way how you would make sure that, you have that same file explorer view by, making those shortcuts into your OneDrive.
Now, we have another question here, and we're almost out of time, but it's a good question. Can you provide some effective strategies for managing event-based records within Microsoft 365? What's an event-based record, and can we do it?
Absolutely. Events-based records are those records that do not start their retention period until an event has occurred. Typically, that is an employee terminating a contract or agreement no longer in effect, a lawsuit that has been settled, a product that's no longer being sold, a procedure that is obsolete. All of those are event-based, and that is going to occur sometime in the future, and it can't be set based on a last modified date or a last created date on the file. It has to be set by an individual making a decision that this item has reached its lifetime.
What's an example?
There are 2 different ways to do that. The most common is what's called when labeled. So you basically, within your file structure, you would create a terminated employee folder. And when an employee terminates, you actually drag their folder into their named folder, into that folder, and it will begin the retention period for 10 or 30 years or whatever your retention period is. So that's the way most companies today handle it. Microsoft does have an advanced methodology for this that's part of records management called event-based records. It requires a level of, I will say, integration with your systems of record that determine when an employee is gone, or like an HR system, or when a contract is expired, like a contract system, in order. And it does require an employee to add a piece of metadata every time they create or save a record. So they would need to add what's called an asset ID. That might be a vendor number or an employee number, something like that. And then they have an ability to say, find all files with this employee number on this retention code and begin retention. We don't see that used a lot, but Microsoft does have 2 different ways of doing that.
And that's an E5 license that you need for
that second event-based does require an E5 license. The when labeled capability I talked about first that most of our clients use, it can be done with an E3.
So real quickly, how do we govern email with M365?
We have a whole webinar on this, but in general, the way you want to think about this is there are 2 different ways. You can manage that within Outlook itself if you still want individual control of all your email by applying retention labels on folders and or items. Or, and the most common way to do this now is to set a single policy on the index and set folders and then force people based on, say, a shorter period of a year or 180 days to actually move their records into their SharePoint repositories where all the rest of the records live. Those are the two primary methodologies. That's a very high level view, but since we only got a few minutes left, as I said, there are webinars where we've drilled down for a full hour on how to do this, but yes, you can do email management and governance within Microsoft.
Right, we have a few more questions. I'm going to briefly talk about us. For those who don't know us, we're the largest independent provider of information governance, AI governance, and privacy consulting services. We do everything from assessments to creating and updating records retention schedules to helping organizations design and deploy M365 as well as other products. We do behavior change management training programs, legacy data remediation. Very experienced team, and we do more of this than anybody else out. We work with more than 30% of the Fortune 500, plus lots of small, mid-sized companies, lots of nonprofits, public sector. Again, we have a very significant experience, and we can help you with that. Before I get to the last questions, I want to shout out, we have a couple webinars coming up on December 11th. We're going to how to hire for information governance. How do you find the right person for that? And then in January 15th, we're going to talk about expanding and modernizing your records program without adding staff. And that's a big issue where a lot of companies these days want to get a larger records program or evolve to an information governance program, but they're not getting the headcount. So what can we do with that? I also want to highlight the fact that we have a virtual in-house governance seminar. One of the challenges is how do we socialize this with our larger team? Maybe you're in the records group or information governance, or you're part of legal or IT. How do we bring in other stakeholders? We provide a complimentary 60-minute seminar where we talk about best practices. This is all virtual. It's pretty easy for us to be able to do. Matter of fact, we can offer CLE credit for this. Not a sales pitch for us, but we're actually doing a lot of these, talking to organizations, sort of getting everybody together. Very, very high ratings from these. And so if you're interested, email us at info@control.com or go to our website for this. And then finally, we've got a variety of white papers, featured articles, additional content. Just go to control.com and we have a lot of this stuff. So I know we're sort of glossing over a lot of issues because of time, but we oftentimes have other pieces available on that. And then I'm just looking at the clock. We have time for a few more questions out there. William asks, is Purview a second line of defense for record security management, so still need a formal document classification system when the document is first created? Which goes first? Do we use the trainable classifiers to find stuff and then records, or do we have people put stuff in the right place and use the data placement strategy, but then we use trainable classifiers as the backup?
I'd actually interpret that question slightly differently, Mark.
Okay.
Yes, you need to have a record retention schedule that says how long things are kept. So there is, the need for a policy and a classification. I won't call it a system, but Purview can handle implementing that record retention schedule directly into the system, again, by creating structures and by putting retention labels on individual folders, on libraries, on sites, or even on individual files if you so desire. So again, you need to have a guidance on how things are classified, but it can fully be implemented in Purview. You do not need another system to sit on top of all of that.
All right, and with that, we are out of time. We didn't get a chance to answer all your questions. Email us. We'll be happy to get the questions. Apologize if we didn't have time, but lots of questions. I want to thank Greg and Andy for sharing your expertise, and I want to thank all the attendees for the fantastic questions we get. So good luck. Think about using M365, and we're hoping that we shed some light on this, where you can use it and where you shouldn't, but take care.